Today's daf is daf Chav Beis. After wishing you a good moed, and we're up to Ve'ein Zokvim Es HaMenorah, which is approximately 15 lines down from the top of the Yomi. And the Mishnah on the previous daf had established that we're not allowed to do what's called Zkifas HaMenorah, to set up the menorah. Stand it up. Micah of it, what violation is involved in standing up the menorah? Amar Rav Chinina bar Bisna, Hacha b'menorah shel chuyos haskinon. We're talking about a menorah that's made of many segments, and you attach the various segments together. It fell, and the various parts, the segments of this candelabra fell apart, and they're disconnected. And now he wants to attach them together. Says Rav Chinina, de michse kibone. This is similar to meleches bone. It's as if he had created a kli that was non-existent, and the Beit Shammai, Savri, Yesh Binyan B'Kelim. So the prohibition of attaching the various parts of the menorah together, according to Beit Shammai, is a reflection of Beit Shammai's general shita that Yesh Binyan B'Kelim. There's a machlokes, and we'll see it right here on Daf Chav Beis, about Meleches Binyan. We know that Binyan applies, as it did in the Mishkan, to something that's mechubar lakarka, it's connected to the ground. What about a utensil that is not connected to the ground? And you create a utensil, according to one mandiyama, which is reflected here in the Shita Beit Shammai, Yesh Binyan B'Kelim. You can violate the Malacha Binyan by creating a kli. And here too, in the chulios of a menorah, when he attaches them together, all these various parts of the candelabra that had fallen apart, now he assembles them and attaches them together, then he's chayiv meleches boneh. And the Mishnah in the 12th parak of Shabbos says, Haboneh kol shu chayiv. There's no minimum shear of meleches boneh. The Gemara talks about a case where you have a little tripod, a teeny tripod, and you put it together. If you hold yesh binyan b'kelim, you violate meleches boneh. Beis Hillel, who allow you to put together the candelabra, this savri ain binyan b'kelim, the ain stira b'kelim. Meleches boneh only applies to that which is mechubar l'karkat, not to kelim. And likewise, the flip side of meleches boneh, which is stira, when you take apart a binyan, that doesn't apply to kelim either. So you have no meleches boneh, nor meleches soser, according to Beis Hillel, in kelim. Now, keep in mind that Beis Hillel would prohibit on Shabbos creating a new kli, but not under meleches boneh. It might fall under any of a variety of different malachos. For example, there's a malacha called makeh b'patish, and when you complete a kli, it might be makeh b'patish, and that's a Gemara Masechet Shabbos on Daf Ayin Hey Amid Beis. If he smooths out the outer surface of a kli, he would incur a chiyuv for meleches memachek, because neither makeh b'patish nor memachek are limited as binyan is limited to mechubar l'karka. They apply even to kelim. And the malacha memachek applies whenever you smoothen out a surface. Like, for example, in the case of the hide of an animal, where there are hairs, and you have to remove those hairs, scrape them off, in order to smoothen out the hide, that's called meleches memachek. Now, sometimes when you make a kli, you have to cut it up according to specific measurements, and that's meleches machatek. And then sometimes, in the case of a basket, you weave together the kli, and that's called meleches oreg or meleches tofer. So there are many different possible malachos that you can violate by creating a kli. But in the case where he puts together the chulios of a kli, like in the case of the candelabra, where the various segments of the candelabra were separated, now he's attaching them together. That could only be possible on the meleches bonet, but they still hold ein binyan b'kelim. There's only binyan in that which is mechuber l'karka. Now the Gemara in Masechet Shabbos on Daf Mem Vav teaches that you're not allowed to be machzir b'Shabbos a menorah shel chulios. And we're going to have to assume that Beis Hillel in our Gemara is matir on Yontif. And there's the difference between Shabbos, which is more chamur, and Yontif, which is relatively kal. However, there is a Tosfos that says there's no difference between Shabbos and Yontif, but rather the Gemara in Shabbos that prohibits putting together the menorah, that's talking about a case of menorah ha'asuya me'evarim hamisparkim. Whereas here we're talking about chulios mechubaros yachad, v'eno misparkos. So in other words, in one case, which is our case, lakula, there you have parts of the menorah that bend in, and he has to bend them out. But all the various segments of the menorah are attached to each other. The Gemara in Shabbos, which prohibits it, is talking about a case where the various segments of the menorah have separated, and he's got to put them all together, and the Rabbanan prohibited them because of its similarity to bonus. Ula ikla l'dei Rav Yehuda. Ula visited the house of Rabbi Yehuda on the night of Yontif. Now, when you have a servant, which is called in Aramaic a shama'eh, then you are responsible for the actions of your servant. And therefore, when Ula came to the house of Rabbi Yehuda, then what happened was, come Shammai zakef la l'shraga. Now, a shraga, which is the Aramaic word for Hebrew ner, is a utensil where you pour in the oil and the wick, and generally speaking, it's made of pottery, of cheres, of earthenware. Now, what happened was this vessel, which contains the oil, was tipped towards the side of the wick, which is that's natural, and that's the way it should be. But it was late at night, and the Mishamesh, the Shameh, thought that, you know what, it's not a good idea to keep this lamp going. So he tipped the kli, which is called the shraga, away from the psila, so that now the shemen was moving towards the opposite side, far away from the wick, and therefore it's going to go out quickly because there's no oil feeding the wick. And that is a violation of meleches kibui, of extinguishing a fire. And when Rabbi Yehuda realized that the shamash of Ula was doing this, Esvei Rabbi Yehuda li Ula, Rabbi Yehuda objected to Ula, why are you allowing your shamash to speed up the process of kibui haner? We learned in a Beitza, hanosein shemen b'ner, if a person adds oil to a ner, chai mishum mavir. he violates a malacha called havara, burning. And if he draws off the oil because he wants to use the oil for eating purposes, chayav mishum mechabe. He is violating meleches mechabe. Now, again, if we were learning the famous sugya of mechabe in Masechet Shabbos, we would find out about something called a malacha she'ena tzricha legufa. But since we're not learning that sugya now, we're going to assume that our Gemara holds, like Rabbi Yehuda, that you're chayav from malacha she'ena tzricha legufa. And that is why the Amora Rav Yehuda, who held like the Tana Rabbi Yehuda, objected, and he said, Ula, how are you allowing your shamash to cause kibui on Shabbos? And you're chayav from meleches mechabe by minimizing and diminishing the volume of oil that's feeding the ner. And if on Shabbos it's also mishum kibui, then on Yontif, likewise, it should be also mishum kibui. Amalei, so Ula said, Lava daita, I have to admit that you're right. I didn't pay attention. Had I noticed what my shamash was doing, I certainly would have objected. Amar Rav, Kniva Shari. You're allowed to remove on Yontif what's called the Rosh Apsila. And that part of the wick becomes what's called pecham. Pecham is kind of like a charcoal. You've seen the top of a wick when it comes black. And Rav said you're allowed to break off the head of the psila, which now has become pecham, because the pecham, as long as it's there, sort of darkens the light of the ner. Now what happens is when he breaks off the pecham, which is on the top of his wick, it's still alive. The flame is still there. When it falls onto the ground, it becomes extinguished. And yet Rav permits this. And the logic of Rav is that just like it's permissible to light a ner on Yontif in order to use its light, again, we avoid it when it's a creation of a light. We take a light from one candle to another. So too, it's mutter to cause the light to go out, to extinguish, by breaking off this pecham and preventing the continuous lighting of this dark charcoal part of the ner. So the question is, we just finished establishing in the previous Gemara of Rabbi Yehuda and Shammai de Reb Zera, Shammai de Ula, that you're not allowed to cause kibui on Yontif. And that's why they objected to the actions of the Shammai when he lifted up the ner and tilted it in such a way that the oil would not feed the flame. Why then does Rav permit it in the case of Kniva? And the Ritva answers, Ein zeh doma. This is not like the case of someone who draws the oil away from the ner, who's chayav because meleches mechaber. Mishum shekol hashemen shebener hu kmo guf echad hadolek. He says that when you have a lit candle, which is drawing, the combustion comes from the oil that it's drawing into the wick. In such a case, the oil and the wick is alive, it's lit, is considered as one entity. And therefore, when you draw the oil away, you are actually being mechaber the ner. Avol, but here, in the case of the pecham, which is the tippy end of the wick, he says it's considered like chatichas eitzim, like little pieces of wood, V'kol achas omedes b'fnei atzma. In other words, although he's preventing the ongoing lighting of that piece of wood, but nevertheless, he is not directly extinguishing a lit wood. And we're going to be makil, at least on Yontif, in order to break off this wood at the end and prevent the ongoing lighting of that wood, because then he's being monea, he's preventing the hadlaka to continue, as opposed to drawing the oil from the nair, which is considered direct kibud. Boy minei avo bar Marta mi'Abaye. Abba requested an answer to the following question, addressed to Abaye: Mahu lechavos esaner mipnei dover acher. The Gemara establishes at the end of Masechet Psachim that sexual relations are prohibited when there's light. And now he's in a situation where he wants to have an intimate relationship with his wife on Yontif, and he wants to know, is he allowed to extinguish the candle for the sake of Tashmish Amita? Is this considered kibui litzorech ochal nefesh? And whenever the body gets hana, any malacha that's done on Yontif for the sake of physical pleasure is considered ochal nefesh. The only problem is that here the malacha is done only as a preliminary to hanas haguf, to remove the nair, which would then permit tashmish amita. You're not doing a malacha that's directly mahana the guf. Amalo efshar b'bayis acher. Let him find a different room, which is a dark room. Ein lo bayis acher might be. He has no other room. Efshar lasos lo mechitza. Let him set up a curtain, a sheet that'll separate between him and the nair. Ein lo. He doesn't have a sheet. Lasos mechitza mai. Efshar lichvos olav es hakli. He can put some sort of a vessel upside down, place it on top of the nair, and the room will become dark. Ein lo klima. He doesn't have such a utensil. Amalei also. He shouldn't do it. He should not extinguish the candle on Yontif. And it seems like Abaye at the face of it is saying that this is not called a meleches ochel nefesh. Now, if Abaye held like that, why did he go through this whole rigmarole? Telling him to find a different room, or alternatively, to set up a mechitza, if that's not possible, to cover the nair with a kli. Why go through all of this in order to tell him at the end of the day that it's awesome? So the Rishonim derive from this that really Abaye wanted to be matir. And the reason for that is because Rabbi Yehuda allows what's called machshirei ochel nefesh. Even if you're doing something that is only indirectly going to facilitate ochel nefesh, it's mutter. So, for example, you'd be allowed to sharpen a knife to cut the meat on Yontif, according to Rabbi Yehuda. Now, Abaye felt that although me'ikar adin, according to the strict letter of the law, we accept Rabbi Yehuda and we are lenient, but nevertheless, halacha v'ein morin kain. We have a methodology throughout the Talmud that sometimes we're not going to teach you a leniency, and we're not going to rule publicly about it because we're afraid of the repercussions. You know, you might get carried away and apply it, and then by analogy to other cases and come to the wrong conclusions. Therefore, Abai really never prohibited it. But Abai was saying, I'm not going to be mori you halacha leheter, because halacha Rabbi Yehuda vein morin kein. And therefore, I'm going to just give you the recommendations of what I think you could do and should do in this scenario in order to avoid having to violate Moleches Kibui. But if there's no other option, then we would allow for Rabbi Yehuda, rely on that shita. It would be considered ochel nefesh that's mutter. We're not going to paskin like that publicly. And therefore, Abai took the official line that it's us. Esvei. Now, Abba Bar Marta was the one who was asking this question about Abaye. He got the answer from Abaye, and now he raises an objection from a Bryce. Ein mechabim es habekas kidei lochus olea. We do not allow you to extinguish a burning piece of wood in order to salvage the wood so that it doesn't go up in smoke. That's not called l'tzorech yontif. You want to save yourself the log of wood, which is worth 10 on the market. That's not called tzorech ochel nefesh, but the bishvil shelo yisashen abayis or akdera mutter. If, on the other hand, you have a log of wood and it's generating smoke, and the whole room, the whole house is full of smoke, and you're in a situation of tsa'ar, you can't tolerate the smoke. Or, for example, let's say you have a pot that is cooking on top of a log of wood in a campfire or the like, and it's going to burn. The tavshil will become ruined. You're allowed to extinguish the fire in order to prevent, in the first case, that the house should not be full of smoke. In the second case, in order to prevent the tavshil from spoiling. And now there's no tzorech ochel nefesh in the case of Oshan. At least in the case of tavshil, it could be considered ochel nefesh. Here we're talking about a case of smoke in the house, and you want to extinguish the fire so that the house should not be full of smoke. That's not considered sorech ochel nefesh, but rather it's for the hanas haguf, so that your body should not have to suffer living in a smoke-filled room. And if that's mutar on yontif, then we should allow kibui aner mipnei davar acher, which means to extinguish the fire so that he could have a relationship with his wife. And that's against Abaye. Amalei, you don't understand. Abaye tells Rabbi Abba Bar Marta that you're making a big mistake. There are two shitos about indirect sorech ochel nefesh. Hahi, the brisa that you quote about allowing to extinguish the logs because of the smoke, that's Rabbi Yehuda. And Rabbi Yehuda later on in Masechet Beitza is of the opinion that you're allowed to sharpen a knife for the sake of using it as a shipud. Shipud means a spit in order to roast the meat or to cut up the meat, whatever it is. Meaning, Rabbi Yehuda holds that machshirei ochel nefesh, that which eventually will facilitate ochel nefesh, is also considered ochel nefesh. And according to Rabbi Yehuda, when the Torah says, "Hu levado yeyosa lachem, lachem l'chol tzarchechem," there's a special ribui. And again, this Rabbi Yehuda later on in Daf Chav Ches, to allow you to do malacha, which is called machshirei ochel nefesh. And therefore, to extinguish the bekas because of the smoke that it's generating, That's called machshire ochel nefesh. And that brisa that allows that is Rabbi Yehuda. The chika mina na, when I said you're not allowed to extinguish a fire for the sake of having relations, that's l'Rabbanan. The Chachamim who rejected the L'chol Tzarchechem drasha of Rabbi Yehuda, and they never accepted the heter of Machshirei Ochel Nefesh. And here, the act of putting out the fire, the candle, for the sake of Dover Acher, of Tashmish Amita, that's only indirect. That's only a preliminary stage before the Hanas Haguf, before the Ochel Nefesh. And again, when Abai is saying that my Isser is according to Rabbanan, even though Abai Paskins like Rabbi Yehuda, but Halacha vein Morin came. And therefore, as far as the official Torah is concerned, we're going to assume that since Kibui al Yidei Davar Acher is called, Mipnei Davar Acher is called Machshirei Ochel Nefesh, therefore it is prohibited. A fire breaks out. Are you allowed to extinguish the fire on Yontif? If there's danger to human life, that's not an issue. And even on Shabbos, you are allowed for pikuach nefesh to violate any malacha and certainly to extinguish the fire. I'm asking a question where there's no chashash whatsoever of sakonis nefashos. It's only a matter of preventing loss of money. Mishum ibud mamon. He doesn't want to have to live outside of his house in the heat of the sun or in the rain of the rains, the wet rains. Are you allowed to extinguish a fire on Yontif for the, again, Hanas Haguf, that you don't have to live under the hot sun or in the snow? Amalei Asu. Rabbah responds that he says it's Asu. And again, the same issue resurfaces. This is going to be Machshirei Ochel Nefesh. Why? Because he's not benefiting directly from the extinguishing of this fire that broke out, but it's a preliminary stage so that now he doesn't have to go out and sit under the hot sun. Esvei ein mechames ha-bekas k'dei lochus olev b'shvil shelo yisashen habayis o ha-kedera mutter. So you see that in order to prevent the fire from generating so much smoke that you'll have to pack out of the house because you can't tolerate the smoke, you're allowed to put out the fire. How much more so if his house is on fire and he's going to have to go running out of his house unless he puts out this fire, it should be mutter. And the answer is, this is all the issue that we mentioned time and time again about machshirei ochel nefesh. Hahi, that brisa reflects Rabbi Yehuda, and Rabbi Yehuda has the pasuk lachem l'tzarkol tzarkechem, and he's marbe even machshirei ochel nefesh. Because minana, when Rabbah says you're not allowed to put out the fire, l'Rabbanan, he was reflecting the shita of the Rabbanan that machshirei ochel nefesh on Yontif are prohibited. And hu levado yasal lachem means dafka ochel nefesh itself, but not a preliminary stage for ochel nefesh. Boy, mine Rav Ashi me'amemar ma'o likchol es ha'ayin b'yontif. Now, by introduction, I have to tell you a lot of what we're going to learn now is way beyond my knowledge of biology and ophthalmology. So the best I can do here in this Gemara with the medical terms that the Gemara uses is to just use the modern Hebrew translation. So the question here is about likhol es ha'ayin. There's something called chol. Chol, I guess you'd call it rouge or some sort of a coloring. And it has a double purpose. It's a cosmetic, but it's also therapeutic. Or this particular type of chol is a therapeutic refuah. So he's got a real problem in his eye, and he wants to take care of it on Yontif. Now, the use of this chol on Yontif, if it wasn't for the sake of the health of his eyes, would be prohibited under what's called the shvus of a malacha. Shvus means that the Rabbana want to separate you from violating a full-fledged malacha. In this particular case, it's probably tzovea, which is one of the 39 malachas, which means coloring, or maleches ksiva, when you put, some sort of a dye and it makes a shape on it. Heichadika sakana. And now the Gemara is going to go into details about ophthalmology. When do you evaluate, assess the situation as sakana because of the pathological state of the eyes? Kigon, rira. Rira is probably what we would call pus. And there's pus coming out of his eyes. In Hebrew, he calls it lecha notefes me'eno v'hu maglid tamid. And it immediately coagulates. So again, if you happen to have an art scroll, maybe he has a footnote on the biology. I don't have access to the art scroll. Then there's something called Beitza. Beitza means that he has a pain in his eye and he feels like there are needles piercing through his eyes. Dama. Dama means his eyes are full of blood. Dim'asa, his eyes are tearing non-stop. Kadachta, his eyes are burning with like a fever. Utchilas uchla. And in all the above cases, I don't have a suffix. You'll do whatever you have to do because this is pikuach nefesh, even though it's tchilas uchla. It's the beginning of what could be chas v'shalom the end, so you got to take immediate urgent care of it. Lomi boile, I don't have any doubt about that. The afilu b'shabishar. If any of the previously enumerated symptoms appear, then you would violate the Shabbos. This is called pikuach nefesh. And our Gemara is based on a sugyan of Avodah Zarah daf chav ches, that chole ha'ayin is a sakana for the entire body. And it's pikuach nefesh that overrides the Shabbos. Kikami boili. What was my suffix? Sof uchla. At the end of this machla. In other words, he's almost at the point of full recovery, but not yet there. And there's no pikuach nefesh, no sakana. Upatsoche ena. He's not doing this in order to save his eyesight, but rather to make it easier for his eyes to see, which is called lehetiv ma'ar enav. By adding this chol, it somehow allows more light to enter into his eyes to relieve his suffering, but he's not at the point of pikuach nefesh. My, is this mutar on yotav or is it awesome? Amalei, Amimer says awesome. Esvei, again, the same objection. Ein mechabin es habakas You don't put out the bekas, the flame of the burning log, just simply to save the log. But if you're preventing the smoke of the house, then you're allowed to do it. The Shani Lay and a Meimer response of Ashi Kidim Chaninan, just like we had the answer of Abai and Rabba, that the brisa that you're quoting that allows you to extinguish the log in order to prevent the smoke, that reflects the Shita Rabbi Yehuda, Lachem L'Kol Tzorchechem, who is lenient with regard to Machshirei Ochel Nefesh. Whereas a Meimar was reflecting the Shita of the Chachamim, that Hu Levado Yasalachem, it's got to be Ochel Nefesh Mamish, directly, not indirectly, not a preliminary stage, and therefore it's us. A Meimar, however, the same A Meimar who is Machmir, Shari Lemichal Eino Minachri, he allowed a guy to do this process. He would blink his eyes in such a way that the guy could put the chal into or around his eyes, Bishabsa, even at the end of his chol. We're not talking about at the beginning when it's pikuach nefesh. And basically, the underlying rule here, the principle in halacha, is that for a chole, we allow a miro liakum. We allow a guy to do a malacha on behalf of a Jew. Ika diamri, others say a meimer gufek chal eino minachri b'shabsa. Not that a meimer made a theoretical ruling, but that he actually called in a guy to administer this chol for his eyes at the end of the choli. Amalei Ravashi la meimer my daitcha. Why are you allowing a guy to do this? You're comparing it to Ula, the Amar Ula Bered Raviloi, called Tzarkei Chola, anything necessary for a sick person, Osim al Yidei Nachri B'Shabbos. We're allowed to do it with the agency of a Nachri. The Omar Rav Hamnuna called Dovar, Shein Bo Sakonom al Nachri V'Yoseh. But that's not a fair analogy. Hani Mili, that's only Echadolo Messiah Ba'adeh. When the guy does the malacha from A to Z, from soup to nuts. Avol Mar, but in order for you to allow the guy to put the chal in your eyes, you're going to have to move your eyes and blink them, and therefore participate in the action. The ka'amitz upasach, he closes his eyes and he opens them, with the eyebrows and everything else. So that's called Messiah. You're helping him, and therefore it's as if you did the malacha together with the guy. How could that be mutter? Maybe responds to Rav Ashi, Rav Zvid the Koik of Asaf. You are right that Rav Zvid would support your position, but Vishanyale, but I gave an answer against Rav Zvid, the Messiah Ein Bo Mamsh. When a person is not actually setting up the malach and making it possible, but that the guy could do the malach even without the Yisrael. He can actually open up the eyes and so forth and so on. Then we apply the principle of Messiah Ein Bo Mamsh. Ameimar Shorel Michal Eino B'Yontif Sheni Shel Rosh Hashanah. He allowed, even in the case where there's no sakana, to do this chal on the eye on the second day of Rosh Hashanah. And the reason for that is because the second day of Rosh Hashanah is only D'Rabbanan. And in a case of a D'Rabbanan, we could rely on Rabbi Yehuda that Machshirei Ochel Nefesh HaButar. Amalei Rav Ashi la Meimar. V'amar Rava says we're only going to be makil on the second day of Rosh Hashanah only for the Tzarech HaMes, to bury the corpse. Only the goyim could be involved in the burial, because Kvuras Mes does not override the Yisrael Malach of Yontif, of Yontif Sheni. Then Yisasku Bo Yisrael Vafilu B'Shnei Yomim Tovim Shel Rosh Hashanah. But all this is only for the sake of Kvuras Hames.